Brutal clash between Lewis Hamilton and Lando Norris after the China sprint. Stay until the end and I'll tell you all the details. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. The Chinese Grand Prix sprint weekend was expected to be routine, another tick in the relentless F1 calendar, another experimental twist in format meant to inject life into what was predicted to be a predictable affair. Shanghai, with its sweeping turns and brutal tire wear, had finally returned after years of absence. Fans were excited. Engineers were cautious. Drivers? Mostly focused. But beneath the surface, beyond the cameras, and far from the scripted interviews and polished PR soundbites, something was boiling. And then, like the flick of a switch, it happened. The moment that would hijack every media cycle, every post-session analysis, every late-night podcast and Twitter space. Not a crash. Not a controversial penalty. But a conversation. A brief, loaded, and intensely dissected conversation between Lewis Hamilton and Lando Norris. One that didn't just ripple through the paddock, it cracked the foundation. At first, it seemed like nothing. A small interaction near the McLaren hospitality suite, just past the branded espresso bar, under the shade of a barely functional fan. No media. No microphones. Just two British drivers. One, a 7-time world champion turned Ferrari pioneer. The other, a mercurial young talent still chasing that elusive first win, but hungrier than ever. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. They weren't supposed to cross paths like this. Not alone, not unscripted. Hamilton, dressed in Ferrari red that somehow managed to look both royal and dangerous, stood with the deliberate stillness of someone used to being watched, even when he wasn't. He wasn't scrolling through his phone. He wasn't talking to a race engineer. He was waiting. For someone. For something. Norris arrived like he always does, understated but impossible to ignore. Hoodie on. Headphones around his neck, though not playing music. They were a shield. He had just stepped out of a data review session, still wearing the slight frown of someone who saw something in the telemetry he didn't like, or perhaps liked too much. The tension wasn't obvious at first. Feels weird being back in China, doesn't it? Hamilton broke the silence. His tone wasn't warm. But it wasn't cold either. It was somewhere in that uncomfortable gray zone between casual and confrontational. Yeah, Lando replied, not quite looking at him. Haven't raced here in F1 yet. But this track, it's got that old-school DNA. Love it. There was a pause. A long one. Hamilton nodded, slowly. Car feels different here, he said. Ferrari's been tricky this season. We're improving, but it's still a long road. It wasn't small talk. It was bait. I've seen you wrestle with it, Lando replied, still half-facing the paddock. Especially through Sector 2. Lot of mid-corner corrections. Rear's still unstable. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. That was when Hamilton turned to fully face him. The corner of his mouth twitched, a half-smirk, half-grimace. Watching my onboard now? I like to learn, Norris said, finally locking eyes with him. Especially from mistakes. Boom. The air between them shifted. Subtle, but immediate. Nearby, a McLaren mechanic who had been casually sipping a protein shake suddenly found something urgent to do in the other direction. Another crew member pulled out their phone, not to record, but to pretend to scroll. Anything to avoid being caught eavesdropping on what was turning into a verbal duel between titans. You're confident, Hamilton said flatly. No point being here if you're not, Lando replied. You taught us that. Or, used to. That one stung. Not enough to provoke a reaction, but enough to register. Hamilton's jaw flexed. Barely. You've got speed, Lewis said. But speed fades. Pressure doesn't. Then I guess I'll find out what breaks first, Norris fired back. There it was. The line. The unspoken declaration, I'm not here to be your successor. I'm here to beat you. It wasn't just two drivers talking anymore. It was legacy versus disruption. The champion of yesterday versus the contender of tomorrow, both existing in the chaotic now. And that's when Hamilton dropped the line no one expected. You know, he said, voice lower now, I remember a race in 2007. China. I lost a championship because of a single mistake entering the pit lane. Rookie year. Slicks on a wet track. I've never forgotten that. You think you're ready for this fight, but you haven't bled for it yet. The look on Lando's face changed. Not to fear. Not to submission. But calculation. Like a boxer studying an opponent's stance mid-fight. I don't need to bleed, he said. I just need to take the shot you missed. And just like that, it was over. Subscribe only if you want Hamilton to win his 8th World Championship and be crowned as the greatest driver in history. Hamilton said nothing. Just gave a single nod. Not approval. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. Then he walked away, each step deliberate, his Ferrari boots clicking on the paddock floor like punctuation marks to a sentence that would echo all weekend. Lando didn't move right away. He stayed leaning against the railing, watching the Ferrari man vanish around the corner. His expression was unreadable, but in his eyes, there was something new. Not just fire. Something deeper. He knew that moment would follow him. Define him. Within an hour, the paddock was electric. People started talking. McLaren staff whispered about it. Ferrari personnel wouldn't comment, but their silence screamed confirmation. The Sky F1 crew caught wind of it. Will Buxton tweeted something cryptic about 2 lions circling the same prey. Fans online began dissecting body language. Lip readers tried to decode shaky footage. And by the time the sprint shootout started, everyone was watching not the timesheets, but the tension. Hamilton and Norris didn't speak again that day. But their body language did. On track, they shadowed each other. In the driver briefing room, they sat 2 chairs apart. When one entered the paddock, the other exited. And somehow, inexplicably, they were drawn together in Q2. Track position shuffled. Hamilton in front. Lando behind. DRS open. Purple first sector. Tense radio comms. And then, Lando lifted. Not because of traffic. Not because of delta time. But because the moment didn't need escalation, yet. Because something bigger was coming. Everyone felt it. A storm had begun, not in the skies over Shanghai, but between 2 minds destined to clash in a battle of eras. Not just for points. Not just for podiums. But for dominance. And the scariest part? This was only the beginning. That's when the world tilted. Not literally, but something cosmic cracked in the air, the kind of rupture you don't hear, but you feel in the marrow of your bones. It started with a post-race debrief. Routine stuff. Both drivers still in their fireproofs, sweat drying under harsh fluorescent lights. Journalists swarmed the hallway outside, their lenses hungry. But inside the garage, in that half-lit, half-private corner behind the telemetry screens, something ignited that wasn't supposed to. Lando was leaning casually against a carbon fiber workbench, still sipping from a bottle of electrolyte water. When he said it, the line that would be replayed, dissected, memed, and feared across every screen on the planet. No venom in his voice. No arrogance. Just that chilling calm, the kind you only ever hear before lightning strikes. Gotta say though, not sure Ferrari will ever give you what Mercedes did. I mean, that ship sailed, right? Hamilton blinked once. A slow, mechanical motion. His mind ran faster than any car he'd ever driven. That sentence, it wasn't just words. It was surgical. Measured. A sniper shot to the ego, aimed with terrifying precision. He didn't respond immediately. No. He processed. He turned his head, deliberately, like a storm tracking its target. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with calculation. Like a chess master 4 moves away from checkmate and wondering if the opponent even knew they were playing. What's that supposed to mean? His voice didn't rise. It dropped. Lower. Sharper. Like a scalpel sliding out of its sheath. Lando shrugged, not taking his eyes off Hamilton. Just saying, it's not personal. You were a monster in the W12. But Ferrari. He gave a pointed glance toward a monitor showing the Scarlet car's tire degradation. Even Leclerc can't stop them from combusting under pressure. And just like that, it wasn't a conversation. It was war. Hamilton took a step forward, barely half a stride, but enough to collapse the space between banter and battle. PR handlers, who'd been distracted by a call from Maranello, froze mid-scroll. Engineers, tightening bolts on a rear wing, paused. The entire garage inhaled and forgot to exhale. "You don't know what it takes to build a legacy," Hamilton said, each word laced with ice. "You've never carried a team. Never walked into a season with the weight of 1 billion expectations on your shoulders. You think a couple podiums and TikTok edits make you a threat?" Lando's jaw clenched. His reply came fast, almost too fast. "I never claimed I was you. But I also didn't chase FIA loopholes to win." That was the trigger. Hamilton stepped so close their faces would have collided if they wore visors. His eyes burned, not with rage, but something deeper. Disappointment? Pity? No warning. "Let me tell you something," he whispered. "If I had that McLaren right now, your car, I'd have 2 wins, maybe 3. And a pole. Easy. You're fast, kid. I'll give you that. But you're not ready. You've got pace, but no venom. No scars. And if you ever compare my legacy to your potential again, make sure you've at least won a goddamn Grand Prix." There was no shouting. No finger pointing. Just that unbearable stillness, like the second before a hurricane flattens the coast. But Lando didn't break. Didn't flinch. "I'm not chasing your legacy," he said slowly, like he wanted the syllables etched into time. "I'm writing my own. And I won't need to switch teams 5 times to do it." That line, that was the blow that landed. Not physically, but metaphysically. A body shot to the legend of Hamilton. The entire paddock held its breath. A Sky Sports mic, still recording by accident, captured the whole thing. And there was more. Because this wasn't just a clash of egos. It was years in the making. Back in 2021, when McLaren was quietly pushing for Mercedes engines, it was Hamilton who allegedly told Toto not to offer them full factory support. That moment buried itself in Lando's mind, a subtle betrayal that soured over time. He never spoke of it publicly, but people close to him said he always remembered. In 2023, during a private Pirelli test in Jerez, Lando outpaced Hamilton in identical tire compounds. That wasn't in the headlines, the data was buried, the session unofficial. But the telemetry existed. Hamilton knew. So did Lando. And now in 2025, with Ferrari floundering mid-table and McLaren on the rise, the roles were bending, cracking under the pressure of the narrative. The old king still held his crown. But the court was growing restless. A mechanic dropped a wrench. The clatter made everyone jump. Still, neither man moved. "Let it go," said a soft voice behind them. It was Andrea Stella, McLaren team principal. He knew what he was seeing. The future trying to kill the past before the past could kill it first. Hamilton took a long breath. The kind that comes after surviving G-forces that bend your ribs. Then, without a word, he turned. Walked out of the garage like a ghost that no longer needed to haunt. Lando watched him go. Didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Just stood there, breathing heavy. He knew what he'd done. He hadn't just held his own. He'd lit the fuse. And somewhere, deep in the paddock, in the back of every strategist's mind, one question echoed louder than the engines. Is this the moment the crown begins to slip? Because the torch isn't passed. It's taken. And tonight, it shook in Hamilton's hands. They were close, so close their helmets had almost clashed in the heat of the pit lane argument minutes before. Now, stripped of visors and suits, it was just raw flesh, beating hearts, and pride boiling beneath team polos and multi-million-dollar egos. The air was electric, thick with unspoken words, and the kind of tension that makes every mechanic glance up from their laptop just a second longer than they should. Every corner of the paddock seemed to vibrate under the weight of what was unfolding between two men, one a 7-time world champion, the other a rising storm threatening to rewrite the narrative with every lap he completed. "You still have to win something before that pen ink dries," Hamilton snapped, voice like a lash. He didn't yell, he didn't need to. The words struck with precision, a verbal scalpel cutting through Lando Norris's confidence with surgical sharpness. Norris didn't flinch, not outwardly. But his eyes narrowed, and his jaw clenched in that silent language only racing drivers understood, where the fight didn't start on the track but in the spaces between words. His freshly signed multi-year deal with McLaren was still echoing through the headlines, and with it came the heavy expectation of finally converting promise into dominance. Before anything could explode, Charles Leclerc appeared, like some strange synthesis of diplomat and warrior. His timing was eerie. Not rushed. Not hesitant. It was as if he'd felt the storm before it even formed. One moment, it was two alpha predators posturing. The next, Leclerc stepped between them, his presence sharp and deliberate. Even his shadow seemed to fall equally between the two, as if nature itself was demanding balance. "Hey. Enough," he said. Not loud. Not soft. Just final. It was the kind of tone that didn't ask for respect, it demanded it. "We're not in karts. We're not 15. We don't throw shade before the race. You prove yourself in it." Norris scoffed under his breath. "Tell that to your teammate," he muttered, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to feign innocence. Hamilton's gaze darkened. A quiet fury rippled through his voice as he replied, "Tell that to your respect." The words hung in the air like fuel vapor just waiting for a spark. Norris didn't engage. He turned and walked off, slow, calculated, his body language screaming defiance. Not fear. Not retreat. Just the message that this wasn't over. That this was only the opening scene of a much longer film. Leclerc turned back to Lewis, his voice now low, almost inaudible over the background hum of tire warmers and camera shutters clicking in the distance. "You can't let him get in your head like that," Charles said. "The whole paddock's watching you. He's not just trying to rattle you, he's studying you. Waiting for cracks. You gave him one." Hamilton didn't respond at first. He stared past Charles, past the paddock, beyond the garages, somewhere far away. Somewhere inside himself. Somewhere dark and private that no one but he could access. A place carved by years of pressure, sacrifice, and the loneliness of standing on podiums no one else understood. "I don't care what he wants," Lewis said eventually, each word deliberate, heavy. "He's not going to rewrite what I've done." Leclerc didn't blink. "Then don't fight shadows," he said. "Race him. Beat him. That's your language. That's the one they all speak when the lights go out." And just like that, he was gone. No nod, no backslap. Just a ghost in red disappearing into the machinery of race day. 37 minutes later, in the heart of the Ferrari motorhome, surrounded by the hum of servers and hushed conversations in Italian, Lewis sat alone. A telemetry screen flickered before him, lines of data scrolling like a symphony only he could hear. Brake pressure curves. Sector splits. Throttle traces. Numbers that, when interpreted correctly, told the story of courage, hesitation, and truth. He was still in his race suit, the top half hanging around his waist. A towel draped over his shoulders, damp with sweat that had nothing to do with heat. His hands were still gloved, fingers twitching slightly, as if rehearsing the steering inputs for a battle not yet fought. The door opened without a knock. A single step. No entourage. No PR handler. Frederick Vasseur. Ferrari team principal. A man with the calm demeanor of a chess master and the subtle menace of someone who knows when to sacrifice a pawn to save the king. "Lewis," he said, voice tight, clipped. "We need to talk. Now." Hamilton turned, slowly. No surprise in his eyes. Just the calm before a hurricane. He knew. Somehow, he'd known this conversation was inevitable the moment he stepped out of that Mercedes and signed his name in Ferrari red. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was why now. Was it about the clash with Norris? The leak to the media that morning? Or something else? Something no one had said aloud yet, but had been swirling beneath the surface like a shark circling just out of sight. Is this about the simulation numbers? Hamilton asked, eyes narrowing. Or is it about who's really calling the shots around here? Vasseur didn't answer immediately. He closed the door behind him and crossed the room with deliberate slowness, pulling a folded document from his jacket. Not paper, parchment, almost. Old school. Confidential. The kind of thing you don't email. He dropped it on the table. Hamilton looked at it. Recognized the logo instantly. Not Ferrari's. Not FIA's. Something higher. Something that didn't belong on any piece of paper found in a normal paddock. "Where did you get this?" Lewis asked, his voice low, calm. Too calm. "I didn't," Vasseur replied. "It was delivered. No sender. Just one instruction, give it to him. No one else." Outside, the track roared to life. Engines screaming, tires screeching, the opening of a new practice session. But inside that room, time froze. Hamilton reached for the document with a steady hand. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the contents. And just like that, the world shifted. Because what was written inside had nothing to do with racing, and everything to do with the next 48 hours. And if Lewis made the wrong choice, the consequences wouldn't be measured in lap times. They'd be measured in silence. He didn't even sit down after the debrief. He just stood there, helmet on the table, gloves still in hand, breathing like he'd done 10 rounds in a title fight, not 19 laps in a sprint. The door clicked shut behind him, but Lewis didn't flinch. The engineers exchanged glances. No one dared speak. Even Angela, who had seen him in every mood imaginable over the past decade, kept her distance. This wasn't anger. This was something else. Something deeper. Something unspoken. He hadn't just crossed a line today. He'd redrawn it. When Frederick Vasseur entered the room, he didn't yell. He didn't throw a laptop. He just stood in front of the 7-time world champion, his voice low, like a blade hidden behind silk. Tell me this isn't what you've become. Hamilton didn't move. Didn't blink. Just stared at the floor, jaw tight. He thinks this is a game, he said eventually. He wants to make a name at my expense. He is making a name. But not because of talent, Vasseur said. Because you're letting him. You've let him turn this into theater. And now, the entire world is watching the legend lose control. Hamilton's voice was ice. I don't care what the world sees. Then you're more lost than I thought. That was the trigger. Lewis stepped forward, eyes locked with Vasseur's. Don't lecture me about legacy, he snapped. I built mine with sweat, sacrifice, and silence. I didn't inherit hype. I earned my crown. And I will not let some kid with a Twitch channel and a funny accent spit on everything I gave this sport. There was silence. And then Vasseur leaned in close. Barely above a whisper. If you stoop to his level, then he already wins. That sentence echoed. And Hamilton knew it. But it was too late. Because the race had already happened. And the whole world had seen what followed. It wasn't the overtake that made headlines, though it should have. On lap 13, Hamilton had pulled off a move so surgical, so impossibly calculated, that it looked like CGI. He braked nearly 8 meters later than anyone thought possible. Lando had the inside line, but Hamilton took turn 1 like he was driving on rails. Tire smoke. Millimetric precision. A dance with physics. Norris flinched, just enough. Hamilton slipped through. It was vintage Lewis. The kind of move only one man on Earth could pull off. But that's not what trended. What trended was the gesture. From the onboard camera, clear as day, middle finger raised. And then, 2 unmistakable words on the team radio. Millions heard them live. Fuck off. And that wasn't strategy. That was war. The aftermath wasn't chaos. It was calculated silence. Mercedes' comms team went into crisis mode. They immediately pulled 3 planned interviews. Lewis was instructed not to speak. A cool-down protocol was initiated, something rarely used, usually reserved for high-tension situations. PR handlers escorted him directly to the garage. But the cameras were everywhere. And when the drivers were ushered into the pre-podium room, the tension could have shattered glass. Hamilton. Norris. Perez. 3 men. 3 mental states. Perez was the ghost, silent, composed, uncomfortable. Norris leaned against the wall, pretending to be relaxed, but his hands betrayed him, fingers twitching, jaw tense. And Hamilton? He paced. Like a caged predator. Helmet still in hand, visor down. Not to protect himself, but to hide what was brewing behind those eyes. Then, it happened. An exchange. The audio was cut, but the camera kept rolling. Norris said something. A murmur. A smirk. And Hamilton stopped pacing. He turned. Slowly. And stepped forward. 3 steps. No words. Just silence thick as oil. Perez stepped between them. Quietly. Like a man who'd seen this play out before. The tension exploded. A water bottle flew. Not at anyone. Just thrown. A crash. A chair scraped back. A crew member outside the room instinctively opened the door and froze. She didn't enter. Just stared, eyes wide, as if she'd walked into a gunfight. Inside, we'll never know exactly what was said. But what's rumored? That Hamilton told Norris, "You've got a fast car, but you're playing a dangerous game." And Norris replied, "You're just angry no one's afraid of you anymore." That line, that stung. Because it wasn't just disrespectful. It was true in the eyes of many. And Hamilton knew it. By the time they emerged for the podium, they weren't drivers. They were symbols of two generations, two ideologies. Hamilton didn't even look in Lando's direction. The champagne bottles popped, but only Perez raised his. Hamilton let his fizz, untouched. Norris splashed his own suit. Not a glance. Not a smirk. Nothing. No words were exchanged. Not then. Not in the press conference. Not even in the post-race flight lounge, where both men sat, separated by a wall of bodyguards and unspoken rage. But that wasn't the end. In the hours after the race, something started to circulate. A photo. Blurry. Taken by a McLaren intern, allegedly. Posted, then deleted in seconds, but not before screenshots spread like wildfire. It showed Hamilton in the paddock, long after media had left, sitting alone. Still in race boots. Phone in hand. Watching a video. The caption? Rewatching the moment. Looping it. Some say he was rewatching the overtake. Others say he was rewatching the gesture, trying to decide if he'd gone too far, or not far enough. Meanwhile, in Woking, Norris recorded an Instagram story. Just 15 seconds. No words. Just his helmet on a shelf, camera zoomed in. Music playing in the background. Not just any song. The Man, by Taylor Swift. The message was clear. And fans got it. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. Shanghai wasn't about strategy or tire wear. It wasn't about constructors' points or data telemetry. It was about power. About legacy. About the terrifying moment when the past collides with the future, and neither backs down. This wasn't just a feud. It was a reckoning. A story with too much fire, too much pride, too much unfinished business to end here. The next round? Baku. A street circuit. Walls inches away. No runoff. No forgiveness. And if you thought Shanghai was explosive, you haven't seen anything yet.